Welcome back, and we're picking up the race on lap 2 as the men head up to Llewellyn. Barrie Clarke was still out front, and on the climb, the 1991 and 1992 National Hill Climb champion had extended his lead to 40 seconds. But it was now David Baker who was his nearest competition, having caught his teammate Adrian Timmis in the twisty single track towards the end of the first lap. Following a strong ride for most of the race at Aldershot, Adrian seems at last to be capturing some of his 1992 form. While also seeing a return to form was Alpine Star's Tim Davies, who looked like he had his old aggression back. The remnants of the early chasing group was now led by another strong climber, Marin's Paul Lazenby. Before the season started, I asked Barrie about his targets for the year.
The first 3 rounds of the Grundigs in Spain, Italy and Belgium, and the BMBF series.
So you'll be concentrating on the Grundig then?
Well, most years I seem to have early season and form, and the first 3 rounds of the Grundigs are early on, so it seems the obvious objective. I'm quite consistent in most of the races, but maybe have a few higher peaks and do well in specific races instead of just being consistent in most of them.
Nearing the end of lap 2, and Barrie was no doubt wondering if he could stay away from David, particularly on the technical single track, which David is so good at. Barrie would fancy his chances if he could be out of sight as they started the third lap, but with the gap now down to 25 seconds, that seemed unlikely. With Adrian only another 35 seconds down in third and just 19 seconds ahead of Tim, the race was still surprisingly close, particularly on such a grueling course. Paul had now been caught by Chris Young and Paul Dixon, while Fred Salmon had rejoined the group. And in the next pack were Peter Stevenson, Richard Thackeray and Andrew Wright. As Barrie crossed the stream just before the end of the lap, he had not only held on to his lead but doubled it as David had punctured and dropped back. There was now a battle for second, with Tim, encouraged by the Welsh crowd, now on Adrian's wheel. Aware of the changes up front, Fred put in a burst to move into fourth and the big points. Heading up to the lake in the women's race, and Deb looked about as strong as she ever had in Britain. Always likely to make time on the descent, but here she was untouchable on the climbs as she increased her lead to 1 minute and 45 seconds. Sally normally feels that climbing is one of her strong suits, but couldn't do anything about Deb, and was also being pressured by Sian until the pace rider jammed her chain to let Sally off the hook for a while at least. Sian is more or less on her own doorstep and knows the course well. Add to that a very partisan crowd, and I'm sure Sian was determined to secure a podium spot at least. Sally Timmis, meanwhile, had managed to halt the slide and was holding on to fourth place, but being pushed by another local rider, Sarah Cartmel. At the lake near the top of the course, and Barrie remained undisturbed out front, while behind him his teammate, for the first time this season, seemed to have the stamina to stay the distance. He had managed to shake off the attentions of Tim on the climb, and the Welsh rider was now having to concentrate on the race behind as David had caught and passed Chris Young, as he impressively regained places after his puncture had seen him drop to 10th. And as Barrie breached the top of the course for the penultimate time, Peter Stevenson had passed Fred to move into 6th. As Adrian came over the top, he was obviously concerned about the race behind him, and he was probably aware that David was heading back up the field and giving Tim something to worry about, with Peter and Fred also in sight. Chris, meanwhile, was obviously suffering just trying to stay with David. Matthew Guy was showing the senior riders that he would be a force to be reckoned with next year, riding into the top 15 despite a puncture on the first lap. By the bottom of the descent on lap 5, Barrie must have been starting to feel good about what would be his first national win. He had now managed to open his lead over Adrian to 2 minutes and 45 seconds, but pushed by David, Tim was again closing the gap, and given the number of midges out to feed, no one was wanting to go too slow. While the battle for fifth was now a three-way affair, with the Saracen rider putting in his best off-road performance to date. While Barrie was looking good, the women's leader was definitely suffering, hitting the quarry climb for the third time, and Deb had found the tank empty. For the first time since lap 1, Sian and Sally could see her, and spurred on by their sight, the pace rider had moved up to second and was taking up the chase. For the previous few weeks, Deb had been concentrating on downhilling, with World Cup races in France and Norway. This meant, particularly with the travelling involved, that she hadn't managed to do any cross-country training since round 4 at Aldershot, and the lack of stamina was showing. As Deb headed for the top, she was taking nervous glances behind and could see just how quickly Sian and Sally were closing. Midway down the descent, and we joined Mudcam on Sian's rear wheel. She'd been unable to close the gap on Deb, but had managed to get away from Sally. As the riders reached a short climb on the fire track, Sian had Deb in her sights and put in a burst to go past her as fast as possible, so as to immediately open a gap, as well as demoralising the flagging Formula One rider. 4.5 minutes down on the leaders, but at last comfortably in fourth was Sally Timmis. On the descent, Sian wasn't able to ease off one bit, as Deb's descending skills had kept her in touch. But with an 8-mile lap and about 450 metres of climbing to go, she was unlikely to remain so. In fact, she would need to dig deep to keep ahead of Sally, who was now only 15 seconds behind. Picking up the men as they come out of the gully at Bike Xpress, and Mudcam was with the distraught Tim Davis as he punctured while in a group of 3 with Chris Young and Peter Stevenson. That was to cost him 7 places, though he did manage to move back into the top 10 by the finish. At the front, Barrie was oblivious to all of this as he headed off for his final lap. He was also unaware that David had managed to reduce the deficit to less than 2 minutes. While behind, Adrian was making it a rally 1-2-3, as he was now 1.5 minutes ahead of the battle for fourth, which saw Peter and Chris tussling for the lead at every opportunity. As Sian started off on her 4th and final lap, she was now fully up to speed, and cheered on by the crowd, she was leaving the opposition with no chance of regaining touch. Sally had moved into second as soon as they started climbing, leaving Deb with what would probably be a painful and lonely last lap. Barrie, though, was neither expecting or wanting company as he headed off on his 5th and final circuit.
Done now and then you close it. Go on.
Heading up to the lake, Barrie caught up with Sally, and they were both having to plough their way through the lapped riders.
Go on, Barrie. 2 minutes on yourself, go on.
But unbeknown to Barrie, who thought he had a 3-minute advantage, David was now 40 seconds behind, and obviously fired up by his puncture, he was continuing to eat into the lead, whilst Adrian was acting as the rally's rear guard in third. A further minute behind, but now comfortably in fourth, was Orange's Chris Young, who had finally got the better of the tiring Peter Stevenson on the climb. On the way back down, Barrie had finally been informed about David's progress, and with the lead now down to 20 seconds, he was having to go again, while Sian was making it look easy at the front of the women's race. David was putting in effort that surprised many, since it was his teammate who was out front. However, one of David's goals was retaining the 7-Up BMBF National Point Series title, and his overall lead was slender, so he was battling for every point, particularly since his closest rival, Diamondback's Nick Craig, had punctured on the first and third lap, so was back in 14th and out of the reckoning in this race. Though 2.5 minutes down, Sally had secured second, while in the men's, Adrian had had to up his pace at the end to stave off the challenge from the habitual fast finisher, Chris Young. Peter Stevenson had lost nearly 2 minutes to Chris as he tied in the final lap, but both he and the third-place woman Deb had done enough in the earlier parts of the race to secure their positions ahead of any late challengers. Once Barrie had recommenced his efforts, he did enough to secure his first national cross-country win, finishing just 15 seconds up on his teammate. And to the crowd's delight, Sian repeated her 1990 national win here.
Sian, a win on home territory.
Yeah, it's good. It's about time I won something this year, so it's great to do it in Beddgelert, obviously.
Fabulous win though.
Yeah, it was a hard race. I think it was fourth or fifth at the first lap, and it's sort of just gradually catching up all the time. So my usual sort of storming last lap, but yeah, it was good. It was a hard race. I got a really bad back after that. It was a lot of climbing and really rough technical descents. So
feeling a bit better. The form's gradually creeping back, so it's. I felt good today. The training's been going well, and I've just started doing some quality because I've had such a long time off. I've been trying to put the miles in. So I'm only just really beginning to put in the quality work for the end of the season.
Went out hard the first lap and I got a bit of a gap and held on to that. And then David was not that far behind me. And then he got a puncture and he dropped back quite a way, I think. And then he did a stormy ride on the last lap and a half, and it was pretty close behind me at the end.
But once you got that gap on the first lap, you seemed to just manage to hold it.
People were telling me I had a 3-minute lead with 2 laps to go, and so I was more coasting along to the finish and not taking any risks. And then David was right behind me again, so I had to put my head down and get going again.
Barrie led a rally clean sweep, which was common in '92, but with increased competition hadn't occurred in '93. And though there was no change in the top 3, Barrie's win moved him to 4th overall. Sian's end-of-race strength showed as she finished nearly 3 minutes clear of Sally, and though Deb had lost another 4 minutes, she was still safe in 3rd. That win saw Sian move into the lead in the overall competition, and with Deb missing round 5 due to racing in America, Sian was looking good for the series. We stay in Wales next week to see if Deb and Jason McCroy can repeat their first round wins in the 7-Up BMBF National Downhill Series.